Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for finding the time to join me today for our monthly Peanut Labs webinar. My name is Annie Pennant and I am the Chief Research Officer at Peanut Labs. It's a company that specializes in DIY sample and surveys. You can always find our full list of upcoming webinars and past recorded webinars on the website under the Resources menu. We are recording this webinar, so if you have to leave early, no worries, we have got you covered. So in today's webinar, I'm going to be sharing a case study about running English language surveys with non-native English speakers. If you have any questions, do feel free to type them into the question box at the side of your screen, and I will get to as many of them as I can at the end of the webinar. So let's get started. Okay, so I know it sounds kind of silly to be talking about running English surveys with people who don't speak English. Why would you do such a thing? But let's consider some background information first. If we take a look at some recent data from the U.S. Census, you can see that about 20% of U.S. residents do not speak English at home. And if you look more carefully, you'll see that about 9% of U.S. residents say they don't speak English well. And if you can, please forgive the census people for the typo in their chart. I know it's distracting, but this is a great example to show that people are not robots. People make mistakes. Anyways, as market researchers, we can see just how problematic it is that about 9% of U.S. residents don't speak English well. Most of us don't provide our surveys in both English and Spanish or English and French, let alone any of the other more common languages besides French and Spanish. Some of those non-English speakers will simply not take the English survey, and then it creates a certain degree of bias.
We got 501
down there.
We have 501 people.
Mute everyone. My apologies for that. Mute everybody. Sorry. All right, so some of these non-English speakers will actually take some of the English surveys, and that will incorporate some degree of bias into the results. These people buy things, and they contribute to the economy just as much as other people. So we're failing to collect opinions from an important group of people. And then there's another group of people who want to help, and they will do their absolute best to answer the survey, translation problems and all. And that is the group of people that I'm going to talk about in this case study. So for this particular study, I used a 12-minute English survey that covered a range of daily activities, from driving to shopping, electronics, eating out, going to work. Most of the questions were fairly generic. You know, do you drive to work? How often do you eat out? Do you eat lunch by yourself or with your colleagues? Fairly neutral questions that everyone can answer without worrying about being screened out. So in terms of defining English skills of people, we included a question on the survey asking people to self-identify their language skills. The trickiest part, of course, was asking about English skills. How do you ask someone about their English skills if they don't speak English? So that's why we worded the question in a simple way. So with this question, about 200 people identified that their English skills were not very good. And it took a long time to get there, simply because I was using a panel that, for the most part, is focusing on English surveys. After this question, however, the rest of the survey used the same language we always used. None of the questions were dumbed down or rewritten into more simple language. It was a very standard questionnaire. So in the first section, I'm going to talk about data quality. I have a number of standard data quality measures that I always use, and I'll go through the results for each of them in terms of how people with better or worse English skills reacted to those specific questions. So most questionnaires have at least a few check all that apply questions, and I really like using those questions to create data quality measures. It means I don't have to figure out how to add a question to the survey and make sure that new question will be relevant. So what I do with these questions is look at how many answers people choose. Are they choosing every possible answer they can? Are they trying to qualify for the survey by choosing any answer that might get them to the next stage? So in this survey, there were 6 separate questions that let people check off lots of answers if they so desired. What you see here is the percentage of people choosing lots of answers for each of those 6 questions. For instance, in the first question, about 15% of extremely good English speakers chose lots of answers. About 8% of good English speakers chose lots of answers, and about 3% of poor English speakers chose lots of answers. So the trend is consistent in about 5 of the 6 cases. It decreases over time, but generally, native English speakers click on a lot more answer options than poor English speakers. On the reverse side, we can also look at whether poor English speakers choose very few answers. Are they trying to get away with as little as possible? Are they satisficing? So we're looking at the same 6 questions this time, but now we're looking at minimal responses. So here we see several cases where poor English speakers are far more likely to choose the fewest answer options possible. In essence, poor English speakers are click-averse. So this is a nice illustration of satisficing, a common data quality problem. Perhaps satisficing is more than just trying to get away with as little as possible. Maybe it's a reflection of being a non-native English speaker who's trying to make as few mistakes as possible. So let's take a look at red herrings. Most of us use red herrings a lot, even though they can be quite difficult to create. You have to do a thorough Google search to make sure a company you've never heard of before isn't already using the word. And you have to make sure the word doesn't look or sound too similar to another brand name so that people don't actually accidentally choose it because it sounds so similar. The good thing is that if you have a check all that applies question, you can easily add in 2 or 3 red herrings. So again, you're not adding in yet another useless question. So here we can quickly see that non-native speakers are more likely than native speakers to choose red herrings. Perhaps they do sound familiar or look familiar, and that is a common problem with creating red herrings. Obviously, if you're not a native speaker, you might not notice a different spelling or think that Starbucks is the same company as Starlux. It just looks so similar. Or you might assume that since it's the only name in the list you don't recognize, maybe it's the so-called correct answer. Now, another data quality measure I like to use relates to following instructions. Surveys are filled with all kinds of instructions, and we know very well that some instructions aren't, if the instructions aren't followed, your data could end up being completely opposite of what you intended. So for this measure, we asked people to choose 3 answer options from a list of about 15 items. And the key part of this is that we didn't have the survey programming validate their answers. People could choose no answers, or 1 answer, or 7 answers. So all we did was figure out who followed the instructions and chose exactly 3 answers. Now, once again, we can see that non-native speakers were more likely to not follow directions. And they failed to follow the directions at almost twice the rate as native speakers. I also like to use a data quality measure that focuses specifically on satisficing answers, the don't know or none of the above answers. This survey included a number of questions with none of the above answers. And we set a cut point for how many times this answer could be used to determine who would fail. And once again, not surprisingly, native English speakers failed at a much lower rate. So only about 4% of native English speakers failed compared to about 11% of non-native English speakers. So non-native speakers were much more likely to use the satisficing none of the above answers. Now, we can't say for sure if they used none of the above because they were trying to take the easy way out, or if perhaps that truly was their answer and because their life experiences are so different from native English speakers that it was indeed the best possible answer. Verbatims are another great way to consider the data quality in surveys. If you have the time and money, I guess a lot of us don't, you can look for incoherent responses or random responses or responses that don't include spaces or punctuation or vowels. Those are excellent techniques if your survey uses a reasonably small sample size. So in this case, we simply looked at the percentage of people providing blank answers. And you can see here that we've divided people into quartiles. In addition, we've divided people into quartiles based on the length of their answer. So you can see first that non-native English speakers were almost twice as likely to leave a blank answer. And they were more likely to provide the shortest answers and least likely to provide the longest answers. So in other words, if your data quality measure focuses on the length of verbatim responses, you'll be more likely to cut non-native English speakers from your data set. So the last measure, the specific measure I'll show here is speeding. In this case, I divided up all the response times into deciles, 10 groups. So this lets us see which group the slow people and the fast people landed in. So for people who were native English speakers, the deciles are quite even. About 10% of people fell into every category. But if you look at the orange line for non-native speakers, you can see it forms kind of a U shape. So non-native speakers include many more people who are either quite slow or quite fast to finish the survey. So in fact, more than 20% of non-native English speakers were in the slowest decile. And about 17% of non-native English speakers were in the fastest decile. So we can read two things from this. First, non-native English speakers might have needed and taken more time to read and interpret the questions and answers. And second, non-native speakers might have had so much difficulty reading the questions and answers that they simply sped through them without properly comprehending them. Either way, the non-native English speakers definitely stood apart from the native speakers in this regard. So I've gone through quite a few data quality measures. There was actually more, but I chose to show only a few of my favorites. So in this case, for every person who took the survey, I added up the total number of, we'll call them errors, that they made based on these data quality measures, as well as the ones that I didn't show. Because I measured so many possible errors, that made it really difficult for anyone to come away with 0 errors. And as you can see, only about 6% of people ended up with no errors. This is just more data to show that people aren't robots. Real people make mistakes, and we can't penalize them for being human and having more to their lives than our surveys. What we can do, however, is look at which people are making lots of errors, a disproportionate number of errors. These are people who are having a really hard time concentrating on, or in a few cases, they're doing a deliberately bad job. So here you see the green line, the highest line at 0, 1, and 2 errors belongs to native speakers. Native speakers, without a doubt, make fewer errors than non-native speakers. And counter that, the orange line, which is highest at 6, 7, and 8 errors, is higher for non-native speakers. So clearly what this means is across the board, non-native English speakers are making more errors. So we've seen the basic data quality differences between native and non-native English speakers. Let's look at how we use those data quality measures. So first of all, if I think about all of my practices, the end result is that I use these data to decide who I'm going to cut from my analysis. Using the total number of errors made by each responder, I come up with a cut score where a certain percentage of people are automatically identified as poor responders. Sometimes it's really obvious, and other times I just have to make the cut somewhere. And I'm usually fairly strict, and I just cut outright about 5% of people from my data. They figure there will always be a percentage of people who couldn't pay attention today. Maybe they did yesterday, maybe they will tomorrow, but today there was kitties at their pants leg, or dinner was late, or they had 3 more emails to do. So these are good people, good responders, just not at this moment. So what's the result? Using my standard 5% process, the result is I ended up cutting about 12% of poor English speakers, about 10% of moderately good English speakers, and only about 3% of native English speakers. So do you want to know how to skew your data? This is how. Are the opinions of non-native speakers less important? I doubt it. Are their opinions different than native English speakers? Probably. Is it fair to cut them? It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? We can look at the verbatims provided by these people providing the low quality data as one indicator, among all of them, of how valid their opinions are. So maybe their verbatims are shorter than average, and maybe the grammar isn't quite so perfect, and maybe they're using more simple words. But if you read through these verbatims, you can see that they are indeed expressing valid opinions. People are doing their best, and they're choosing words that they know and can use well. And they're succeeding at telling us what they do with their cell phone and what they think of this survey in good words, in their own words. So how can we say that the rest of the answers coming from these people are not valid, or that these people are cheaters or liars? Could it simply be that they're giving less substantive answers to avoid giving bad answers? So the next step is we decided to look at all of the data quality measures together to figure out if maybe some measures are better than others at predicting data quality. Maybe some are better at predicting language skills, and that's really not the outcome we're aiming for. So to do this, we ran a regression model to determine which data quality questions best predicted English skills. And clearly that is not the goal of what we're doing. We're not trying to create data quality questions that pick out non-native or native English speakers. That's really not the intent. Now at the top of the list was one of the underclicking variables, and a second underclicking variable hit significance as well. Underclicking would normally be seen as a satisficing variable. So English skills could be predicted by how many answer options to a check all that apply question were chosen. More answers chosen equals more likely to be a native English speaker. Similarly, English skills could be predicted by answers that contradicted each other and by ranking questions that weren't answered properly. So imagine if we had only used these indicators of data quality. We would be instantly removing non-native English speakers from our data set, instantly biasing our data towards people who were fluent English speakers. Now, on the other hand, we could also identify a number of data quality measures that were not good predictors of English skills. Rather, they were simply measures of data quality. So for instance, clicking on many answer options, also an indicator of trying to qualify for incentives, did not predict English skills. And straight lining and not following instructions were not good predictors of English skills. So taking these two slides together, we've got a great list of data quality measures that don't predict English skills, but do demonstrate, do allow us to pick out people who are providing low quality data. So even though we've said that some of these questions just aren't good, there are lots of data quality questions available that aren't language discriminatory. All right, so we've got all the nitty-gritty details. Let's just figure out what we can do going forward. Now, fortunately, there are very easy and free solutions to this problem. If we focus our data quality techniques on measures that are less English discriminatory and more data quality discriminatory, our data will include more opinions from non-native English speakers. And this will make our results more reflective of the population and more generalizable. So all we have to do when we're choosing our data quality measures is put more emphasis on overclicking, straight lining, following instructions, and red herrings. These are great measures that don't unfairly pick on non-native English speakers. And as always, make sure you choose several of these measures, not just one, because human beings make mistakes, even the census folks with the little typo there. We can't penalize someone because they misunderstood one thing or they got distracted on one question. There are a few other things we can do as well. First, we need to be very careful to avoid slang and idioms and acronyms even when we think they are commonly known. Things like seeing eye to eye or cost an arm and a leg. They have a lot of meaning to me, maybe to many of you. They seem so common that everyone ought to understand them. But to someone who wasn't raised in your neighborhood, at your school, or for that matter in your country, they might have no clue what those mean. Those phrases can easily throw off the data for one or several subsequent questions. Also, if you must have a minimum number of options chosen for a question, consider validating that. Have your survey programmers ensure a minimum number of answers so people who aren't sure what to do have some frame of reference. And of course, if you're using this as a data quality question like I do, then that's a different story. And as we've heard so many times, keep the questions short, keep the answers short, use white space. Long sentences with no breakpoints are intimidating for native speakers like me and also native non-speakers. Not everyone is a fan of 1,000-page Charles Dickens novels, so let's make everyone's life easier and focus on short and sweet. So that brings me to the end of this study. I would love to take any questions you might have at this point. You can type them in the box at the side of your screen. And I'm just going to give you a minute or two to do that, and then I'm going to scroll through the questions and pick out a few that I can give you a nice solid answer to. So let's see what we have got. All right, we've got a question. How much of panels do you think are comprised of ESL respondents? Interesting question. It's I'm not sure if I have a solid answer other than most panels have a focus on the language that is going out. In Canada, the focus is in English. In the US, it's in English. But given that people are so comfortable with the language of the country where they reside, and they're used to trying to get by in that language, there will always be a proportion of people who end up in a panel that isn't quite the language that they are comfortable reading and writing. I would love to find out exactly what that percentage is. It's hard to say. It's hard to measure simply because of the language barrier. But if anyone else out there has answers, I would love to hear that. Okay, other questions? Let's see, we've got, oh, does this mean we have to translate every survey into 10 languages? No. Well, think about the typical survey. If you're only looking for 300 or even 500 completes, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to translate that survey into 5, 6, 7, 8 languages just to get that 20 more set of completes. But if you know your work is going to focus on certain groups of people who are very likely to be non-native speakers, then of course it is essential to translate. You can't do a survey on, I'll take the worst case scenario, immigrant experiences or even political issues without considering the wider audience. It's not a population until you've got the entire population. So maybe it doesn't make sense for 300 completes for a typical marketing research survey, but it makes a huge amount of sense if you're looking at a larger survey that has serious implications for social policy. Let's see. Another question. Did you consider education as a controlling variable? On this specific case, no, there was age, gender, and region, a bare minimum of cases, but it certainly could have some impact. Someone who isn't necessarily perfectly fluent in English, if they've gone through a full educational system, their grammar may not be perfect, they may not be perfectly fluent, but they've got a lot of experience reading, writing in another language, so they may not be your typical non-native English speaker in this sense. I've got just another minute. I'll see if I can find one more question here. I may have addressed this one a bit. Am I missing out on key insights from my North American-wide but English-only community? So the easy answer to that is probably yes. There will always be a certain segment of people who just aren't comfortable enough with the language and therefore don't participate in the survey. So that's a chunk of people who could provide very specific responses, very different responses to a survey. And as I mentioned, if it is a survey about something such as political issues, that's a very important group of people that could be missed. Similarly, if those people do try to answer the survey, then there are going to be some issues with their responses. Their style of responding is going to be a little bit different than English speakers. Obviously, costs are going to prohibit a lot of the translations, but if it's an important topic, then certainly Spanish in the US, French in Canada, to me that's a bare minimum. If it's an important issue, you really need to consider looking at those other languages as well. All right, we have reached the end of our time. If I didn't get to your question, absolutely do feel free to email me, Facebook me, tweet, LinkedIn, absolutely. And I will do my best to answer your question. Also, one last thing, let me give a plug for the ESOMAR Market Research Conference that is happening next Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. They are going to be broadcasting on their own TV station. So if you head over to the ESOMAR website, you can watch all of the sessions live for free. So enjoy. I will actually be one of the speakers, so if you feel like it, I'd love to have you listening in on the ESOMAR TV. With that, I'd love to wish you fabulous data quality and response rates over 60%. Bye, everyone.